Lynch. 2 seconds, 1 second. Kobe pump fake. Kobe for the win. Kobe Bryant.
2. He loops out to left field. Going to be a tough play. Jeter on the run. Makes the play. And flies into the stands. Oh, what a play by Derek Jeter.
Roethlisberger. Has time. Throws to the back of the end zone. And it is caught for a touchdown by Holmes.
This is the Personal Foul Podcast. I'm your host, Colton Gesser. We're back for another show this week. Got a special guest coming on the show this week. Lance Medow covers the New York Football Giants. Lance, you'll hear Lance on the Big Blue Kickoff Podcast. You also hear Lance during the pregame, halftime, and postgame for the Giants. I listen to him all the time coming back from Giants games. Thanks for coming on, Lance.
Hey, my pleasure, Colton. Thanks so much for having me on the program. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, looking forward to talking some Giants football with you. I know you cover them. Heard you quite a bit leaving MetLife, coming back in the traffic on the turnpike, listening to you talk about the Giants postgame. So definitely thought, man, Giants have a lot to look forward to this season. And I think the Giants can be a really surprising team this season. And I wanted to hear from the man who covers them.
Well, absolutely. I hope that I can certainly answer all of your questions. And as far as the Giants are concerned, Colton, as you mentioned, I think this is a team that still has some question marks, specifically on the defensive side of the ball, because there's a lot of unknown at this point. New defensive coordinator, a lot of youth. On the offensive side of the ball, they are bringing back the nucleus from last season. But again, a new offensive coordinator in Jason Garrett. So there's intrigue. I think that's a good way to describe this team. But the land of the unknown could be good, could be bad, could not mean much of anything. I think the fact that this offseason also is all virtual and nobody's working on the field adds yet another bunch of question marks to the Giants. But they have a lot of young players who have a great deal of upside. It's a matter of whether or not I think this group could take the next step. And some of the guys could pick up, of course, where they left off from last season.
Absolutely. As you're talking about the young pieces, we'll get into the free agency and the draft after we talk about, I think, the big piece here. Daniel Jones had a great rookie campaign, had the fumbling issue, but what do you expect coming in here from year 2? Sat beyond Eli for the first few games. Then he took over, and he actually was very, very good. He had very, very good games, fantastic against Tampa Bay. He did have the fumbling issue last season. What do you expect from Daniel Jones this season? You see a sophomore slump, or do you think he continues to grow if his receivers can stay healthy, Golden Tate, Shepard, and Evan Ingram?
Well, as you mentioned, he did have a very impressive rookie campaign. I think the numbers prove that. 24 touchdowns, 12 interceptions. He completed about 62% of his passes, but fumbling was an issue. 18 fumbles, lost 11. Let's put it this way, Colton. The Giants had 33 giveaways last season. Daniel Jones had a hand in 23 of them. So I think that says a lot, and that's a big reason why the Giants had the worst turnover differential in the NFL. They were tied with the Chargers at minus 17. Can't win football games. I don't care how much talent you have, how much upside. If you don't protect the football, if you give the ball too much to the opposition, you're going to be playing catch-up all season. And that, unfortunately, was what the Giants had to deal with. As far as what to look forward to this season, here's my one concern, Colton, with respect to Daniel Jones. It really has nothing to do with him. It's more of the fact that this is yet another season where he's learning another new offense. And that's a big issue for a lot of young players. I don't think that Daniel Jones can't handle it. So I don't want anybody to misinterpret it, but he was at Duke, so he's working with David Cutcliffe's offense. Then he came to the Giants last year. Okay, he was working with Pat Shurmur. And now, year 3, he's working with Jason Garrett. That's 3 offenses in the span of 3 years. And one quarterback that I always bring up in this conversation, Colton, is Alex Smith, who unfortunately is still recovering from that gruesome leg injury. Alex Smith, if you go back to when he was drafted by the Niners, he had about 7 or 8 different offensive coordinators in his first 7 or 8 years. Things clicked, no coincidence, once all of a sudden Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman came over as the offensive coordinator. So that's my concern about Daniel Jones. But as far as the intellect is concerned, he certainly is more than capable, I think, of adjusting to a new offense and thriving, assuming that the offensive line takes some steps forward. They certainly addressed that in the draft, and Saquon Barkley stays healthy. The good news for Daniel Jones, despite the change in the offense of coordinator, is the fact that, as you noted, the receivers that he worked with last season pretty much are all coming back. Golden Tate, Sterling Shepard, as well as Darius Slayton. And let's throw Evan Ingram into the mix too, because he is certainly a part of the receiving corps. So all of that, I think, is encouraging. But if the protection is there, the balanced rushing attack, yeah, I think there's no reason why Daniel Jones can't pick up where he left off. As far as the turnovers are concerned, Colton, that is really a wild card right now. Some of it was his own decision-making. Some of it, of course, was the environment around him. So you hope that more experience, working with NFL caliber players, anticipating the pressure that you're going to see, gets him in the right frame of mind to handle those circumstances. And I think like any young quarterback, usually they struggle sometimes with ball security and decision-making early in their career, and it tends to get much better as the years move forward. So I think that's certainly encouraging for a guy like Daniel Jones.
Absolutely. And talking about the new coordinators coming in, kind of reminds me of Baker Mayfield. Baker had that great rookie campaign, sophomore season. Yeah, it's kind of different. I mean, Baker might see what happens with Baker this season, having a new head coach with Stefanski coming in. But yeah, sticking with the Giants here, I expect Daniel Jones to have a good season. The only good thing, I get the fumbles are a problem, and it needs to be fixed. But I feel like that's something easier to fix instead of like Jameis Winston, for example, a ton of talent, just can't read the defenses and is turning the ball over with interceptions, not fumbles. That's something I feel like he can fix with practice. Do you agree with that, or you think it's more that he might have more of a turnover issue this season? But do you think, knowing that he can practice with the fumbling, it's not interceptions, that it's not that big of an issue?
Well, I think you bring up a great point. The fact that, once again, he had a 2-to-1 touchdown to interception ratio. Yeah, where to go with the football was certainly not an issue for Daniel Jones. I mean, for a quarterback to come in week 3, when you weren't the starter, you weren't getting the number 1 reps at the beginning of the season and in training camp, and then to have a relatively smooth transition for the most part, absolutely. I don't think anybody should be discouraged by that. If anything, that's a huge positive because he has a good feel for the offense immediately, and he was going with the football to the right places. Fumbling is more of a mental game. It's more of, once again, as I mentioned, the environment around you. If there's anything that can be correctable, to your point, Colton, it's absolutely protecting the football when you get hit. It's a matter of reps. It's a matter of it becoming second nature. So that I don't think is anything to worry about in which it can't be improved. However, the one thing I did want to add, you brought up Baker Mayfield, but this goes back, Colton, to my point about when you change offensive coordinators a lot. If you remember, Baker Mayfield, think about how many play callers he worked with in the span of his first 2 seasons. Todd Haley was his offensive coordinator initially. Then they made some drastic changes. You had Hugh Jackson and Todd Haley. Okay, both of them. Then all of a sudden, Freddie Kitchens becomes his offensive coordinator midway through year number 1. And then Freddie Kitchens is promoted to head coach, and now Freddie Kitchens is gone, and Kevin Stefanski is there. So it's not to say that Baker Mayfield, once again, can't handle multiple offenses. It's not to say that Daniel Jones can't handle multiple offenses. But the one thing that I've seen, and this is big picture in the NFL, the more you change the environment and the play calling for a young quarterback, the more and more you're just throwing another stumbling block in the way of that young quarterback. So that's my biggest concern about Daniel Jones. It's not that he can't handle it. It's that why do you want to put more stress on a young quarterback when, as you pointed out, Colton, the priority right now is get him to develop, get him comfortable. Change is not necessarily a great thing for a young quarterback or a veteran quarterback. You don't want to change the environment. You want to provide stability. So that's why I say if there's anything that you may want to look out for, it's how quickly he adjusts to this new offense, especially in a year where clearly there's not going to be much on-field work.
Yeah, it's crazy. And as you touched on with a bunch of changes, as we've talked about here, when you look at a lot of these veteran quarterbacks, Tom Brady, Big Ben, Phillip Rivers, Peyton Manning, all these guys had stable coordinators and head coaches. Figure Ben had Cowher to start off, then he hopped into Tomlin, and Tomlin's been here this whole time. You haven't had many coordinators in Pittsburgh. Same thing with New England. And they're very stable franchise, and look how the quarterbacks played out. I don't know how many great quarterbacks in this list that we just named have had multiple coordinators. They've usually been a few changes over the years, like Bruce Arians moving on from Pittsburgh, Todd Haley there, Randy Finkter now. But other than that, not many changes, even with Brady Belichick there in New England. You don't have many changes, and these quarterbacks don't like changes.
100%. All you have to do, once again, as I said, is look at the veterans who have thrived. Even Drew Brees, Colton, let's throw him into the conversation. Since he arrived in New Orleans, he's had Sean Payton, right? How about Aaron Rodgers? Aaron Rodgers is now learning a new system with Matt LaFleur, but all those years he had Mike McCarthy. So when you have stability, when you have the same language that you're utilizing season in, season out, yes, the personnel is going to change, but from a quarterback standpoint, and once again, I didn't play the position, but I'm just speaking from experience. It's much easier to adjust to a new wide receiver over the course of an offseason. You can easily get on the same page as opposed to now all of a sudden, Colton, you're asking a quarterback to now learn a completely different language. And look at Eli Manning. We don't even have to go far. If you remember when Eli had to start learning Ben McAdoo's offensive system, and he had good statistical years under Ben McAdoo, but there was also the ankle injury one off season because he had ankle surgery he had to overcome. And, sometimes things didn't all of a sudden go very smoothly initially. And then he had to learn Pat Shurmur's offense. So even at the tail end of Eli's career, they were throwing a lot of different offenses his way. And many people will say, well, why was Eli Manning not necessarily having statistically his best seasons? Yes, part of it was the offensive line. Part of it, of course, was not necessarily having consistent rushing attack. But the other piece of this equation, of course, was the fact that he was learning a number of new offenses in a very short period of time over the latter part of his career. So whether it be a veteran or a young guy, it's no coincidence when you look across the league, the best quarterbacks thrive when they're given stability.
Absolutely. And that's what's crazy. We're going to move on after this, but what's crazy with Tom Brady? You would think at the end of his career like this, he wouldn't want to change offenses, but here he is going to a different, very, very different offense with Bruce Arians in Tampa Bay with a lot of deep ball, go get it for these stud receivers from Godwin and Mike Evans and my Lord Gronkowski now, O.J. Howard, Cameron Brate. Man, they're going to see a bunch of tight end sets. But then going on to the next topic for the Giants, one of the biggest steals from last year's draft for New York, Darius Slayton. I didn't mention him in the first round with the receivers. You did. Darius Slayton had a great rookie campaign for a fifth-round draft pick for the Giants. My Lord, did they hit on Darius Slayton.
They absolutely did. And you know what's interesting? If you go back to rookie minicamp, Colton, Daniel Jones and Darius Slayton were working out together for the first time, and clearly they built a tremendous amount of chemistry moving forward once Daniel Jones became the starting quarterback. But people forget, going back to rookie minicamp, Slayton had the case of the dropsies. I mean, he couldn't catch anything. He couldn't haul in much. So that's what I think makes his story even that much more impressive, because the Giants coaching staff would be the first ones to tell you, if you go back to June, would they have imagined that Darius Slayton would have had the season he had? And I don't think, if most coaches were being honest with you, I don't think they would have said, yeah, I would have thought Darius Slayton was going to be one of the top receivers on the team. So, that says a lot about how hard he worked and how much he got more and more on the same page with Daniel Jones. And when you can get that type of productivity, as you alluded to, in the fifth round, where the Giants have had trouble in the later rounds, going back to recent history, that's when all of a sudden you start building depth and you don't have to tap into free agency. So Slayton, huge bright spot last season, and you hope that he picks up where he left off. And he really became the vertical threat. That's what I think was key, the big playmaking ability down the field. Now, you could argue when it comes to the Giants receiving core right now, maybe they're missing that big, tall presence as a red zone threat. However, I would argue, I think Evan Engram can certainly serve as that weapon. But what I like about the receiving core right now, everybody brings a little bit something different to the table. Sterling Shepard and Golden Tate, a lot of people were talking about, well, they overlap. But you can certainly put the both of them on the field at the same time. But Slayton is something different because of that vertical threat and because of that big playmaking ability. So very positive results. Small sample size still, of course. You want to see him, as I mentioned, build off of this. But I think the Giants are extremely encouraged based on not just what he brought to the table at times last season. I would argue he was, for the most part, a very consistent weapon, meaning you knew what you were going to get out of Darius Slayton from game to game, and you knew that he had a very good feel for Daniel Jones. And If you could do that in year one, Colton, then absolutely you feel good with, of course, once they get back on the field and work out a little bit more together, how it's very high in terms of what he could do in year number 2.
Absolutely, and I'm liking that you mentioned that bunch of different feels in that wide receiver group there. Shepard and Tate, you can go with the same thing, very similar guys, but they're really not though. Shepard, oh man, I hope he stays healthy for the Giants. I think that he can be a really, really big weapon for Daniel Jones if he can stay on the field. Golden Tate, little darty guy. You saw those when the Eagles traded for him, those nice little cuts they use in the red zone with him. Speed, that nice quick release that he has could be a problem for defensive backs. And Evan Ingram, that mismatch nightmare, as I mentioned to you when I messaged you to get on and what we were going to talk about here, Evan Ingram would be a top 5 tight end if he's on the field. My Lord, that man has all the talent in the world to be a top 5 tight end in the National Football League.
People forget, and I bring this up all the time, Colton, Evan Ingram was on pace for a career year last year. And unfortunately, the injury bug struck. But if you look at his production in the early stages of the season, you look at his numbers, if he stayed healthy, Evan was going to shatter every statistic that he had set in his first 2 seasons with the Giants and probably would have gotten up there in terms of one of the all-time great seasons for a Giants tight end. That's how productive I thought he was, and that's how good he looked. And that was something from just conversations that I had with him in the offseason. He knew that the skeptics were always questioning, well, Evan, is this going to be the year you play 15 games? Is this going to be the year you maybe play 16? I mean, he knew that cloud was hovering over him. And unfortunately, you look at the numbers, 6 games last year. And that's the $1 million question. Is this going to be the year? Not that he can produce. That's not even a question. We know what Evan Ingram is capable of doing. The bigger question is this going to be the year where the injury bug stays away? And you also referenced Sterling Shepard. Here's the other thing. When you look back at 2019, I know the offense is going to change, Colton. So you can only read into the numbers so much because it's a new play caller and a new language. But what a lot of people also forget, and this is not to build an excuse for the Giants because, let's face it, their offense was productive last season. If anything, it was the defense that was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and you had to really go into a game thinking you got to score 35 to 40 points because it's highly unlikely that the defense is going to come through and make consistent stops for all 4 quarters. But getting back to my point, the problem on offense was you really didn't have the core together consistently. And what I mean by that is when Saquon played well, you thought that was encouraging, and then all of a sudden he got hurt. He had the high ankle sprain. It really wasn't 100% for the rest of the season. As I mentioned, Evan flashed early, but then what happens, Evan then gets hurt and has to go on IR ultimately. Sterling Shepard with the concussions, he was in and out of the lineup. Golden Tate was suspended for the first 4 games. So my point is, did we really ever see a time, Colton, where you had those 4 guys on the field at the same time? No. The answer is you really don't know what these guys could do on the field together when they're all out there. That, I think, is certainly something that's more encouraging entering 2020. But the injury bug is something that you could ask me 100 times, Colton, do I think all of them are going to be on the field at the same time for 15 games? And no matter how much I know these guys, no matter how much I've watched them play, I would be throwing out BS if I told you, yeah, they're all going to be on the field for 13 games, because nobody can answer that question. Nobody has a crystal ball. The injury bug is the one thing that's impossible to predict. It's impossible to get a good grasp on. And Sterling Shepard and Evan Ingram, unfortunately, have some baggage in that department. Saquon has been a fairly durable guy even going back to college. And Golden, I think, has been a fairly durable guy. But those 2 guys are X factors, the first 2 that I named, Colton, because if they can stay healthy, then you're talking about, okay, hey, what can Jason Garrett do with the offense? If they're in and out of the lineup, then once again, it's going to be a guessing game, and it's going to be dependent on who on the Giants' depth chart can step up. And one guy in particular that I pointed to last season, but unfortunately he tore his ACL right at the beginning, was Corey Coleman. Coleman's back on the roster. Coleman is a guy that unfortunately has had some off-the-field issues, injuries too. He's a guy who we haven't mentioned. You put him on the field, he's healthy. Hey, there's now that 4th wide receiver that I think could do some damage here.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned Corey Coleman. I was going to bring that up when we got into the re-signing and the free agency in a little bit. Yeah, I think that's a very underrated signing. Corey Coleman, a lot of talent. Browns drafted him. Didn't pan out in Cleveland. Corey Coleman has a lot of talent. But going into the biggest probably news of the offseason right now, want to hear your take on this. Everything going on with DeAndre Baker, last year's first-round draft pick out of Georgia. What do you think's going on? Any news on that? Any updates for the fans here and what's going on with DeAndre Baker?
As far as new developments, there's really nothing to report on that front, and mainly because at this point, the Giants are using the law and watching the legal process play out as guidance. So until we get, Colton, any clarity on the legal front, it's really hard to say what's going to happen with DeAndre Baker and also what's going to happen with respect to the league. So it's really hard to get a good grasp on Baker, at least in the short term, with respect to the Giants. The good news, though, is this. They have a young nucleus of cornerbacks because they invested in youth last season through the draft and then in years prior. And I'm talking about a guy like Sam Beal, who year one, it was a redshirt year because he couldn't play because he was injured. Corey Ballantyne is another young guy. Let's not forget about him. They brought in James Bradbury as the veteran, who certainly had a productive career in Carolina. But to me, the key is going to be who outside of DeAndre Baker, out of the young corners, is going to step up and emerge. Because Baker is one component, but whether Baker's on the field or not, they still need this other group to make a name for themselves and to show that they can consistently produce. Love is another guy who I think is a candidate to perhaps start at the slot position. They just drafted Darnay Holmes out of UCLA. I mean, I could sit here, Grant Haley. I just named you, Colton, 5 different cornerbacks, not named DeAndre Baker. So while I understand the conversation is focusing on Baker, and in all likelihood, Baker and Bradbury were penciled in as the 2 starters, even though Patrick Graham at this point has not released any depth chart, nor have the Giants. But I think what Giants fans need to understand, you could focus on the 2 starting cornerbacks and whoever they were going to be all you want. But depth is going to be important for this Giants defense. I think Patrick Graham is going to mix and match. I think he could potentially put 3 safeties out there at one point and lean heavily on the slot corner position, especially if he uses some blitzing here and there. So my point is, regardless of the uncertainty, Colton, surrounding DeAndre Baker, the ceiling for this Giants defense is going to be determined based on what the 3rd corner does, what the 4th corner does, what the 5th corner does. And those are the guys I think that you really have to watch in terms of their development and how they're utilized within Patrick Graham's defense before we really can see where this defense could go in 2020.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned James Bradbury. We're going to get into the free agency, which I think the Giants had a very, very good free agency. I thought Bradbury was probably one of the best free agent moves out of all free agency for the price tag that the Giants got him for, knowing that he's one of the top 2 corners that was on the market. Byron Jones getting a whale of a contract, 5 years, $82.5. But the Giants getting Bradbury in a 3-year, $45 million contract. I think that is a steal for the Giants. Bradbury was very, very good in Carolina, as you mentioned earlier. I think the Giants got a steal with that pick in free agency with Bradbury. I was very happy seeing that with the Giants. Blake Martinez, not getting enough credit. I want to hear your take on Martinez here in a second. I think Blake Martinez is a very, very underrated sign for the Giants. The media is not loving it because he wasn't the past guy. But over 100 tackles, multiple seasons, I don't know. You tell me what you want at middle linebacker. I think Blake Martinez is a very underrated middle linebacker. I don't know what your take is on it, but Cameron Fleming, Kyle Thacker also from Green Bay, Colt McCoy to back up Daniel Jones. So I want to hear your takes on their free agency. I thought they had a very, very good free agency.
Well, this is what I'll say about free agency in general. I think the biggest issue from a media perspective, Colton, from a fan perspective sometimes is people get caught up in names. And what is the one lesson that I think we all need to learn from NFL free agency? Very rarely, Colton, does the team that wins free agency actually have that translate to the field. Let's use Cleveland as an example, and I'll certainly get back to the Giants. I don't want to try to get off topic here, but I'm using other teams just as a means of an example. Cleveland, a lot of hype surrounding the Browns last offseason, around this time last year. And They made big splashes. They made acquisitions, whether it be trades and free agency. And Cleveland did not fulfill its expectations. And that's why sometimes the teams that find the complementary pieces in free agency, but do the heavy lifting in terms of the draft and development, are more often than not the teams that have more success. So if you look at the Giants' free agency this year, they didn't necessarily make a big splash. Bradbury probably is the biggest splash in terms of name or notoriety. And the Bradbury signing was key because they parted ways with Janoris Jenkins late last season. And as I mentioned, if you have a bunch of young corners, you need somebody, forget on the field, you need somebody in the cornerback room who's an extension of the coach that is going to be able to be that extra voice to help groom these young guys. So that filled that void. And also Bradbury has a very good track record of being matched up against the top number one wide receivers when he was in Carolina, and has a good track record of having success. So when you remove a guy like Janoris Jenkins, who was the closest to a lockdown corner that they had, and to say that the Giants were going to go into a season where it was going to be two second-year corners, be there two guys on the outside, that's putting a lot on the plate of a secondary, which, by the way, Colton, is going to have to do a lot of the heavy lifting this year, especially with still some question marks in that pass rush. The Giants only have one guy on their roster who's had double-digit sacks, and that's another free agent they brought in, and that was Kyler Fackrell. But outside of that, everybody else, we're talking about a 5.5 sack season, a 4.5 sack season. So this, to me, is going to be a defense defined by its secondary. That's more of a reason why the James Bradbury signing was key. You brought up Blake Martinez. Well, here's the thing. If you're going to talk about an offseason where you don't have much on-field work and it's all virtual, then I think it's important to have players that have some connection to the coaching staff. And if you'll notice, the one theme that took place this offseason, Colton, was the Giants brought in a lot of players that either had a connection to Joe Judge, had a connection to Jason Garrett, had a connection to Patrick Graham, had a connection to New England, had a connection to Dallas. And I don't think that's a coincidence, because I think part of that is, let's bring in players that are familiar, that can help teach some of the new guys the schemes, especially in an offseason, which now they didn't know this at the time when they were signing a lot of the free agents, but I think it's sort of a blessing in disguise that you have somebody like Blake Martinez, who was in Green Bay with Patrick Graham in 2018 when Patrick Graham wasn't the defensive coordinator, but he was his positional coach. So Graham's got a good feel for Blake Martinez. I brought up Fackrell. Well, Fackrell was on that 2018 Packers roster with Martinez, who was his linebackers coach, Patrick Graham. Dion Lewis was with Joe Judge in New England. Jason Garrett has connections to Cameron Fleming, who you brought up, has connections to Cooper Rush, who was a quarterback they brought in, who I think is going to be a strong asset for Daniel Jones. The reason why I'm naming all of these guys, it's a theme. And I think it's critical to have players that know the system, know the coaching staff in an offseason where you're going to have limited on-field work. Here's another guy that we didn't mention, who I actually think could be one of the most underrated offseason signings, and that's Nate Ebner. Nate Ebner has ties to Joe Judge. They were together for Ebner's entire career in New England. And the reason I bring up Nate Ebner is special teams, probably the unsung heroes of the Giants team last year, probably for the last few years. Thomas McGahee's done an excellent job. Cody Core, Michael Thomas. Michael Thomas is no longer with the Giants. He's now on the Texans. You need somebody to fill the void left behind by Michael Thomas. Nate Ebner is that guy. So when you look across the board, I think the Giants addressed various facets of their team through free agency. But don't overlook the fact that, once again, a lot of these guys have connections to either the scheme or the coaching staff. And that, I think, is going to be critical in an offseason where most of these players are not going to be on the field together for the majority of the offseason.
Yeah, that's what's crazy going into an offseason like this, something that no one's ever dealt with when you get in big free agency and you're not able to get these guys implemented into the team, how everything functions with the team, especially with a new head coach like Joe Judge, a new offensive coordinator in Jason Garrett. It's definitely hard bringing in these new pieces and not able to get them face-to-face and running things up. But hopefully the NFL and Roger Goodell pushes things through. I know New Jersey opened up the facilities for the Giants and the Jets, so hopefully we can get things rolling here on that side of things. Hopefully some positive news football-wise. Getting into the 2020 draft for the Giants, I thought they had a very good draft again here. I think McKinney in the second round out of Alabama was a steal for the Giants, first-round talent getting in the second. What's your overall take on the draft? Do you think they messed up going Andrew Thomas number one? Because they had some defensive players there sitting there that they could have taken to shake up the defense. Do you like protecting Daniel Jones with that first pick?
Well, let's look at what the Giants have done in the draft each of the previous 2 years. They invested in a dynamic running back in Saquon Barkley, Colton. Then they followed that up in finding Daniel Jones, who they hope is their franchise quarterback. So to me, the next stage in the evolution of building up your offense is protect those two players or open holes for one of the two players in Saquon Barkley. So it's the logical move to then find the anchor of the offensive line. And who knows, between Andrew Thomas and Matt Peart, who they got in the third round out of UConn, the Giants may have found the bookends to their offensive line. And those are two guys who are going to be on rookie contracts for at least the next 4 years. Thomas, of course, will have the option for year 5 because he was a first-round pick. And you want to build the nucleus together. So, once again, it's hard to argue against investing in the offensive line when you have the quarterback and the running back that are going to be dependent on the trenches. And remember, they also drafted Shane Lemieux in the later rounds out of Oregon, who could be an option at center, who could be an option at guard. He's an interior offensive lineman who has some versatility. So they gave themselves some depth, and they gave themselves options for competition. And also, if they want to experiment with Nate Solder and move him around, Thomas is an option at left tackle. He played both sides of the line at Georgia. So I like where they went in terms of giving themselves some flexibility on the offensive line. But this is the question that I've been asked a lot, and you somewhat alluded to it. Well, yes, the Giants could have used a defensive playmaker. There's no doubt about it. I won't disagree with anybody entering the draft because the pass rush was a question mark. The overall defensive production was a question mark. But, for the ones that want to argue Isaiah Simmons versus Andrew Thomas, I think you need to take that a little bit deeper. If you would have drafted Isaiah Simmons and then you would have, let's say, taken an offensive lineman in the second round, because, of course, you're not going to take Xavier McKinney under those circumstances, Colton, do you get more of an impact with an Andrew Thomas on the offensive line for the next 5 years or so? Or do you get more of an impact out of a second-round offensive line? And then the same thing has to be said about, does Isaiah Simmons alone single-handedly save your defense in year one? My answer would be no. I think Simmons is a great player. I think that he's a dynamic player. He's a versatile player. But I think if you bring in Isaiah Simmons in your defense, you really have to know where you're going to put him because he was moved around so much at Clemson, where he played at least 100 snaps at 5 different positions. I don't think you could throw that on him in year one. So my answer is I think Andrew Thomas has much more of an impact on the Giants in the short term versus any other player on defense that you would have brought in. And it takes more than one player on defense right now to help this unit. Because as we mentioned, there's areas that they need to address in the front seven as well as the secondary. And when it's all said and done, between Andrew Thomas and Xavier McKinney, they may have found their defensive playmaker, Colton, in McKinney. I spoke to Nick Saban. I have had conversations with a variety of people who have seen McKinney. McKinney was the first safety taken, number one. He just wasn't taken until the second round. McKinney was arguably the best safety in this draft. So if the Giants wind up getting one of the 4 best offensive linemen, tackles if you want to be more specific, in Andrew Thomas, as well as the number 1 safety, it's hard to argue that getting that 1-2 punch of the first 2 rounds is something that the Giants shouldn't have pursued instead of settling for Isaiah Simmons and maybe the top offensive lineman, but it's going to be now the 7th, the 8th, or the 9th guy on the depth chart or on the rankings list. And as far as McKinney is concerned, he was moved around and utilized just as much as Isaiah Simmons. They're different players because they're different body types, and McKinney is certainly somebody that I think you can develop around your defense moving forward, depending on how Patrick Graham wants to utilize him. But once again, you go top to bottom in that draft, I think the Giants made out very nicely in terms of depth on the offensive line, as well as options between Darnay Holmes and McKinney to come in year one and play immediately, which the Giants certainly can utilize.
Absolutely. Yeah, I like the Thomas pick at 1. I did like the Isaiah Simmons chance there with the Giants. As you did touch on, though, you made a very valid point. He's not going to change your defense in year one. So as talented as he is, it's not going to make a big change to the defense. The defense is not going to be good. So would you rather protect your franchise and Daniel Jones, which they did, because he actually has a very, very solid offensive line now. And they did that. They protected him, and they did Andrew Thomas with the first-round pick. I think Isaiah Simmons fell to a very, 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 very good spot with the Cardinals. But you saw it. You saw him there, and teams just didn't take him. And he fell perfectly into the lap of Arizona.
Well, and I think part of that is, and I would agree with you, I think that Arizona is a very good fit for Isaiah Simmons, especially since they drafted a guy by the name of Tyrann Mathieu, who is now with Kansas City. And I know Matthew's a safety, but Mathieu also coming out of college was that versatile guy out of LSU. And Arizona really honed in on his skill set, and he was able to flourish. So I like the fit for Isaiah Simmons in Arizona. But the reason why I think Simmons didn't go as high as people projected is because of also the role of the linebacker in today's defense. And with that being said, certainly the Giants have had their ups and downs at the linebacker position. But what I mean by that, when you look at high first-round picks and value in what teams really put a lot of substance behind, they're normally talking about an anchor left tackle. They're talking about a quarterback. You're looking at an elite pass rusher. You're looking at a lockdown corner, because those are the critical components that you want to build your team around. Not to say that a linebacker is not important, but sometimes with the linebacker being taken off the field on third downs and teams going with 5 defensive backs or 6 defensive back looks, once again, it goes back to the question of how much are you going to utilize Isaiah Simmons, where are you going to put him, and how many snaps are you going to give him? And once again, I think Simmons has the versatility, but every defensive coordinator is going to answer that question, Colton, very differently. So that's what I think it really came down to with respect to Simmons. It's about him in comparison to other positions and how much they're utilized, especially in year one.
Absolutely. You see that with Philly. Philly has no linebacker depth at all.
Perfect example, yeah.
Especially on the inside, where teams like Pittsburgh value their middle linebackers very highly, and you saw it after the Ryan Shazier injury. Pittsburgh kept putting Band-Aids on that spot until last year they went up, traded up surprisingly to get Devin Bush out of Michigan, and man, did he fill that void for Pittsburgh and change that defense. So as you touched on, it really matters on the schemes of the defense, how much it matters for that team to have a middle linebacker position. And as you touched on, it might not be the biggest need for the New York Giants.
Well, linebacker right now, coming into this offseason, I think they certainly wanted to shore up the middle linebacker position and add perhaps a few edge rushers. But keep in mind, the James Betcher defense is going to be very different from what Patrick Graham is running. And he's probably going to have multiple fronts with 3-4 looks and 4-3 looks. So it really depends on, well, how many times you're going to have 4 linebackers on the field versus how many times you're going to have 3 on. I think right now between Blake Martinez, Ryan Connolly coming back from injury, who had really some nice flashes. People forget, he was a key component of the draft class last year. And we were talking about Darius Slayton. Well, Connolly was a late-round pick last year. Unfortunately, he tore his ACL. I think they have options at that linebacker position. Time, of course, is going to tell. And I'm not saying that the linebacker position is not important for the Giants, because anybody who's watched Giants football and you see what the tight ends have done, you want a guy that can cover down the field, and you want a guy that can help clean up and tackle consistently. Martinez has made his money off of being that guy that cleans up. That's what he did in Green Bay. And Connolly is a guy that, once again, was opportunistic before he got hurt, and also is more than capable of cleaning up and being that guy that piles up the tackles. So you like some of the options the Giants have on the roster, but I would be the first one to tell you, linebacker, I'm not saying that it's not important to the Giants. It's just Isaiah Simmons versus other guys in the draft. That's how you had to weigh it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So what are your overall takes for Joe Judge, first-year head coach in the Giants this season? Where do you think they finish up in the division? Do you see any surprises, possible playoff now that the extra wild card team's added? What do you expect overall for the Giants this season?
Well, as you noted, this is going to be a year in which we're going to have 7 playoff teams in each conference. As far as how I look at the division, Colton, I think that the Eagles and the Cowboys on paper have more talent and more proven commodities. And Philadelphia also, unlike any of the other 3 teams in the division, is bringing back the coaching staff and bringing back the core. And in an offseason, which I continue to emphasize, where it's all virtual and we don't know how much on-field work they're going to have, we don't know what training camp is going to look like, it's going to favor teams that have their cores in place. So it's hard to put the Giants ahead of the Cowboys and the Eagles under those circumstances, specifically Philadelphia, because Philadelphia did not change its coaching staff. Dallas did. But Dallas also kept Kellen Moore as its offensive coordinator, who was there with Jason Garrett, also was a quarterback previously backing up Dak Prescott. So that adds the continuity layer. And they've got a lot of veterans on that team, even some of the veterans that they signed in free agency. So that, again, I think bodes well for Dallas. And I think also from a talent perspective, Dallas right now has, as I mentioned, a number of more productive players than I think we know at this point based on what we see on paper for the Giants. So, I think right now, based on the paper test and based on the land of the unknown, the Giants right now are that 3rd position with respect to the division. I think it's not a stretch to say that they could be in the wild card hunt because, as you mentioned, they're adding another playoff spot. But who knows what you're going to need to get that additional wild card spot. Remember, that's fluctuated. Some years, Colton, you may need 9 wins. Some years you may get away with 8-8, or maybe you're lucky and it's a 7-9 year. I think based on track record, you need at least 9 wins to have a legitimate shot to grab that wild card. And
especially in the NFC.
Of course. And we're talking about a team, as you mentioned, with a first-time head coach, with a new coaching staff, a young quarterback, a defense that you're still trying to get a feel for. That may be a tough position to ask for the Giants to get 9 wins dealing with all of the uncertainty of the offseason. So this is what I say when everybody asks me about what do I expect out of the Giants or what would be an indicator of how you would evaluate this team. My response, Colton, is you really need to look at the individual players and see where they're going. And what I mean by that is you want to see Daniel Jones make strides and get a good hold and grasp of this offense. You want to see O'Shane Ximenez and Lorenzo Carter, some of those young pass rushers. You want to see them start to break out and show consistency. Dexter Lawrence is another guy. This is about the individuals because this team is so young. That's what you need to see out of this Giants team. It's not so much about, well, this team has to go from 4 wins to 8 wins in order for me to see progress. No, see, that's not what I think. I think it's about what are the individuals showing you. That, to me, is going to be the true sign of progress for this Giants team. It's not going to be one of these, I expect a 180 out of the Giants, and I expect them to go from bottom to top, which certainly is feasible in NFL circles. But once again, when you evaluate the uncertainty of the offseason, the state of this division, a first-time head coach, that's a lot of challenges that is going to be thrown at the Giants before we even step on the field for a meaningful game. And I don't think it's crazy to say there may be some ups and downs as a result of that. So you've got to be realistic in terms of how you evaluate a team. And I think that, to me, is the most realistic outlook for the Giants this season.
Yeah, they definitely have a tough schedule this season. AFC Northwest is going to be really, really talented, opening up with the Pittsburgh Steelers on Monday Night Football. Yeah, it's going to be a very interesting season for the Giants. Lance, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast. As you can tell, folks, if you want to talk some Giants football on Twitter, anything, this is the guy to go to. Man knows his stuff when it comes to the New York Football Giants. Lance, thanks for coming on.
Hey, Colton, my pleasure. Greatly appreciate you having me on the program. Very much enjoyed the conversation, and I look forward to continuing to have the conversation about the Giants with you and others moving forward. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Again, to find Lance, you can listen to Lance on the Big Blue Kickoff podcast. You can also hear Lance in the pregame, halftime, and postgame during the NFL season for the Giants. You can also find Lance on Twitter at Lance Medow. So, again, Lance, thank you very much.
You got it, Colton. Thanks so much for having me on. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir.